things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, for all of our kids in here today, I want to say welcome. We're glad you're here. I also have the answer to Pastor Liz's question right in front of me, actually. I'm going to give you a hint, okay? Are you ready, kids? Write this down. You ready? Here's my hint. The answer is somewhere between 5 and 1,000. Okay? All right, so now you know. There's my hint. Somewhere between 5 and 1,000. Today, I was told, first of all, I should let you know a little behind the scenes here. I was told that because it was Family Sunday, I had to preach less today. Better go fast, Tim. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to make this a little faster today. I know some of you adults are even excited. That's cool. I understand. I want to talk a little bit about a vision for children's and youth ministry, why it is this matters so much to us at Crossroads. And so in order to talk about that, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience as a child and what I remember and what frustrated me. And then, you know how sometimes your childhood can drive you later on in life? Well, when I was a child in the late 1980s, my family went to a Methodist church. Any of you have experience with a Methodist church before in your life? Okay, I went to a Methodist church. And basically, Methodist is a fancy way of saying kids need to sit still and quiet and listen. That was my experience. I did not have a children's ministry. I didn't have a children's church. I went to big church every single week. And the most exciting thing I ever got to do when I was a Methodist was I was given one of those big, long acolyte candles, and I got to walk with fire and light candles before the service. That was by far the most excited I would be about going to church, was when I was given fire and I got to light candles during the service. To be fair, that is kind of cool. But also, I just sat in service, and I remember being bored, and I remember my mom had a move. I don't, like, maybe your mom had a move, or your mom has a move. My mom's move was the snap. That thing echoed through the sanctuary, and everyone looked, and everyone knew it was my mom and that it was me. Boom! Still to this day, I can barely hear snaps without just sitting up straight, thinking I've got to behave. Someone busted me and caught me. Now, in the early 1990s, my family moved, and that's when we joined our first Church of the Nazarene. And at that point, I was in 5th grade, and that church had a children's church, and I went to children's church. And it was great because I got to go and be in an active environment during the worship service. And then in 6th grade, I got moved to the youth group, which I was really excited about because now I could be a teen. But then my district, this was in Louisiana, made a decision outside of my church. It had nothing to do with me. I was not the cause of this decision like I know some of you are going to think. And they decided to move youth groups a couple weeks into the school year to 7th through 12th grade. And so I went to youth group for a few weeks. A decision outside of my church sent me back to kids ministry. And I spent the rest of my 6th grade year going to children's church as a middle schooler, and then within minutes getting sent into the big service because I couldn't behave myself. My definition of a walk of shame is being a middle schooler and opening the back sanctuary doors and walking through the church to find my mother, only to get the angriest look you could possibly imagine, to wonder, what did you do this time? And have to explain it to her later. So anyways, youth group was an amazing experience for me. By the time I got there, I had a great time in teen ministry. But kids ministry, that era and time of my life, was a whole series of trying to behave and not being able to pull it off. Trying to be good, but not having the capacity to do so, and getting passed in between the adults and the kids. And usually when I had to go to the adults, it was because I was in trouble, and then I had to behave even more, and I was capable even less. And so kids ministry is important. It's an important ministry of the church. It's something that I'm passionate about because I want to see kids latch on to the story of Jesus and make it their own. We put a lot of time and money and energy into having a good kids ministry at church. And as you know, most weeks, our kids are flooded throughout the entire building with lots of volunteers and lots of classrooms and lots of age-specific material. And you might even wonder to yourself in a moment like this, well, if we have such a good kids ministry and so many great volunteers, why in the world do we do this to have them come into our service? Seems like we have a good thing going on in there, and this can be kind of stressful. And I imagine some of you have probably already snapped at your kid to snap in line while this service has been going on. I know that sometimes this can be a little stressful. I know that. But I want to talk a little bit today about why we do it, why we do what we do in a global sense, what research is showing, because there are people who are at Christian universities who are researching what causes kids to most likely to grab onto the faith and then hold it through their entire life. And that is ultimately our goal. Our goal is not to make church fun for kids today. Our goal is not to let you have a breath for an hour so they can do their own thing. Our goal is to hand the faith to our kids and our teens so that they will make it their own and they will own it for their entire lives. This is what we want. We want our kids to meet Jesus. We want our teens to meet Jesus. And we want them to follow Jesus all the days of our lives. That is what we're trying to accomplish with kids and teens ministry. And why do we do that? We do this because Jesus instituted it. Pastor Liz read the verses, but I'm going to read them again to you, if you don't mind. It's a short little text. It's found in Matthew chapter 19, just verses 13 to 15. It's fairly famous. A lot of us know these things, but it's always good to be reminded that Jesus, in a world where kids were not seen as centered or important or valuable, they were seen as like future workers. Jesus brought them to him the same as he brought people who were sick and ill and needed prayer and wanted to know God. They were the same as adults. And so, if you would, I'd invite you to stand with me as we honor the reading of the word of the Lord today. Matthew chapter 19, verses 13 to 15. Then people brought little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them and to pray for them. But the disciples rebuked them. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." When he had placed his hands on them, he went on from there. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Now, in our world, in our society, in the United States of America, 2024, we center children. Children matter so deeply to our society and the way we do things. We spend an exorbitant amount of taxes in order to have the best schools. We put a lot of time and money into youth sports and youth bands and recitals and plays and acting. We tell our kids to find their passions and their interests, and then we chase them around from practice to practice, event to event, and we want them to become full-bodied, fully talented, differentiated adults. We put a lot of time and energy into the interests and passions and skills of our kids in the world we live in today. Some of us in this room did not grow up that way. This is a fairly recent phenomenon. Children are centered in our society. So to some degree, it's not terribly hard to tell to the church, we ought to make children's ministry matter in our church, because that's the way our society works in so many ways. Kids matter. But kids haven't always mattered in this way. Kids have not always been centered. Kids have not always had priority. For example, it wasn't that long ago in this very country, let alone biblical times, that people were having children in order to fill jobs on the farm, right? There would be the 9th, the 10th, the 11th kid. And while babies are being born, the oldest are now waking up at 5 a.m. to milk cows to keep the family business and food on the table going. That is the story of not some ancient reality of the biblical world, but this very country in the last 250 years. Childhood is a fairly recent phenomenon in terms of the way that we understand it. Get them educated, have them have interest, let them play. This is less than 100 years old in the history of the world. Now you want to go back to Jesus' time, and this was even starker, even different than the world we live in now. In fact, many historians will say that it is actually the Christian imagination that actually began to treat all children with dignity. Kids born in unsafe environments or with illnesses or diseases would sometimes be cast off and even left in ditches and on the side of the road. It was Christians who began housing orphanages and treating all children, no matter what circumstances they were in, with dignity. We taught the Western world to treat children with dignity, to treat them as people and not just possibilities. And this is from texts like this, where the disciples are like, hey, kids, you're getting in Jesus' way. Jesus is here to heal, to preach. You be quiet, and you sit on the sideline. The disciples aren't the bad guys in this text. They're just normal people in the world that they live in. And Jesus instead says, whoa, let them come to me. Let them sit on my lap. Let them tell me their name. Let me hear their story. Let me spend time with them. Jesus opens up our imagination to the fact that children should matter and they should be a part of our faith experience. Now, it took a long time in the church for us to start getting our mind really around this. You see, there was a man named Horace Bushnell who was an American who was actually a part of the founding of the College of California, which became a part of the University of California in Berkeley today. He was around in the 1800s, and he wrote a book in 1847 called Christian Nurture. And he changed the trajectory of the church, especially in the United States of America. Until 1847, the basic idea in the church, especially in the United States of America, was eventually you have these tent revivals, you bring in charismatic speakers, you have a really ecstatic worship experience, and God might grab you out of sin and save you. And so the belief was that adults got saved. And they got saved by charismatic revivalist services where the worship would be great, the singing would be incredible, the preaching would be strong, and people would feel conviction in their adulthood for the things that they've done, and they would come to Jesus. Horace Bushnell wrote this book in 1848 saying, no. Kids can have faith too. Kids can meet Jesus. In fact, if you bring kids to Jesus, as Jesus invited them to, you might be able to raise them in such a way that it never occurred to them that they were anything but Christian. He was the first person to ever write this. He was the first person to ever suggest that it was possible for kids to have faith, to come to Jesus, and to learn about Jesus. Well, you may know what comes from there. Sunday schools start. Once we figure out motors, buses start picking up kids in neighborhoods around the United States of America. The world changes out of Bushnell's writing, saying, no, it doesn't take falling into sin and then repenting in order to become a Christian. Kids can be taught the way of Jesus, and they're capable of, they may not be able to explain to you the Trinity in some sort of seminary level way, but they can understand that God loves them and wants to be in relationship with them. And this changes the trajectory of the church over the next 150 years. And so today I want to share with you some of the things that are being talked about in terms of how to help kids and teens come into faith. Because it's very important that we remember this, especially out of what I've talked about so far. Jesus does not say at any point, children, behave yourselves so your parents can listen. And oftentimes, that's the disposition that we want to take. We want the kids to shut up and to get out of the way and to go somewhere else so that we can listen. But Jesus says, no, bring the little children to me. This is important. And so the Fuller Youth Initiative, Fuller is a seminary in California. It's kind of seen as like the Harvard of evangelical Christianity, I guess. You know, I don't love that comparison perfectly, but you get the idea. It's in Pasadena, California. It's a very important Christian seminary. They have been studying what churches are doing that are reaching young people and what young people who are sticking with the faith are saying was meaningful to them in their time in the church growing up. And so we ought to ask ourselves, we're spending time and money and energy, people resources. All of these resources are being dedicated to having better and better kids and youth ministries across the American church. What's working and what isn't? What are we putting good money towards? What are we putting bad money towards? What are we putting good people resources towards? What are we putting bad people resources to? What actually matters in terms of what young people long for, and then what helps them stick when they become an adults? And so there are 6 things that Fuller says, after all of this research, that churches ought to be focusing on to make sure that young people come to an authentic faith and then stick in the church. The first of those 6 things is this. Empower younger people. Empower them. Let them be a part of the church. Tell them to lead. Don't just wait for them to get 45 before you let them lead for the first time. This is really important, I think. And for any of us who have been through our 20s and our 30s and even our teen years, you might remember thinking, well, people listen to me at work. Why don't they listen to me at church? I'm getting treated like I matter in my college. I have something to say around a meeting table, but no one will listen to me at church. You might have been there before. I'm really proud of our worship band today. I got here at about 7:30 this morning and looked down here and I saw at least 3 teenagers that I know were at homecoming last night at their school, already here, ready to go to play music for us this morning. Isn't that incredible? I remember, yeah. When I was a teenager, we had to make up this thing where we all wore our suits to dress in church the next day to get teenagers to actually go to church the next day after homecoming. And now they're here playing keys and guitars and leading us in worship. That's empowering young people to lead. Not saying, oh, they might not hit the right notes. Who cares? They're leading, they're finding their place, and they're becoming involved in leading the church. The next one. There we go. Empathize with today's young people. The struggles of today's teens are not the same struggles that you had when you were a teen. The struggles of today's kids are not the same struggles that you had when you were a kid. And that's okay. And it's not a battle either. This is like the dumb things that generations do. Well, back in my day, yeah, I'm sure it was tough to be 14 or 12 or 7 when you were that age. I'm sure it was. There's no doubt about it. But it's different. It's not supposed to be harder or worse. It's just different. And so how do you empathize with young people? How do you empathize? Well, you get to know them. You listen. And I found this to be really key. And this is really hard for me because I'm a fixer. I like to fix things. You don't just try to fix their problems. Just listen. Let them share. Let them talk. Let them talk about what seems like barriers and struggles, and then give advice when they ask for it, which they will eventually, but only after trust. And so what you need to do here, if you're going to help young people, is to empathize with them, but you're going to have to get to know them. You're going to have to learn their names and their stories and wait for them to begin to share with you. This takes time and energy, but it's deeply important. The third thing they found to help, take Jesus' message seriously. Take Jesus' message seriously. You see, there's a problem in our culture today that has seeped into the church. And I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, I'm just saying this is what it is that the American church has fallen into the trap of what is called moral therapeutic deism. Have you ever heard that term before? Moral therapeutic deism. That is the predominant faith of Americans today. This is found by researchers, theologians, everyone. It happens in and outside of the church. Moral therapeutic deism. Moral being like live a moral life, make right choices, do the right thing, be a good person. Moral, therapeutic, that God exists to make you feel good, right? So if you do the right things and live a moral life, God will make your life feel good. And then deism is the idea that God exists and is the creator, but isn't particularly involved in human affairs. So the most common theological belief of Americans is this, that if you do the right thing, God will make your life feel good, but he's not that involved. Young people don't just buy hook, line, and sinker what their parents believed. This has been the case of generations forever. This is not new to today. And so young people are engaging with Jesus. In fact, Jesus is one of the most popular figures when people are polled on this. People really like Jesus. You don't even have to have faith to be into Jesus. Jesus is compelling to young people. But they don't see older people taking Jesus' message seriously. They see him falling into this trap of moral therapeutic deism, just arguing and pushing and kicking at young people to make better decisions. Then their life will go okay, and God doesn't particularly need to be a part of this. But the message of Jesus is radical and difficult and complex. Jesus invites us to care for the poor and the imprisoned, and young people love to be a part of justice missions, and they're compelled by the stuff that Jesus says. And they want to know, are we actually following the Jesus of the scriptures, or are we living in this other world of religion? The fourth thing they find, if you want to reach young people, fuel a warm community. Loneliness is an epidemic of the aged and the young, but warmth in the community matters deeply. And churches that are reaching young people have warm communities. The fifth one, prioritize young people everywhere. Prioritize young people everywhere. I'm always reminded that when I walk guests through Crossroads, I show them children's room and teen room after children's room and teen room. I think we're doing this pretty well. But prioritize young people everywhere. And then finally, the sixth thing they find is be the best neighbors. Be the best neighbors. Because the message of Jesus is love your enemies. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so churches that are reaching especially young adults, especially those ones who had faith to some level or to some point, are finding that when kids go to college and then move to a new city, the ones that are connecting into churches are going to churches that aren't saying all the time, hey, come to our church, we have the best church, we have great music, we have great events, come to our church, be in our building. But they're going to be a part of churches that are about being a part of their community around them. They want to be a part of a body that goes, that takes risks, that is involved in things outside of themselves. That this is deeply important to young people. And so these are the 6 recommendations in order to reach young people. And then what they find is these are the churches that are maintaining young people, but the things that young people who stayed in the faith, they say, the 3 things they say over and over and over that they had in their life. They may not articulate this is why they stay, this may not articulate what they're looking for in a church, but consistently, young people who are raised in the faith, who stay as adults, say they had these 3 things in their life. 1, a mentor or an adult in their life who was not a parent, who was a Christian. Now, parents, you matter, right? We know this. But the ones who stay in the faith don't just have Christian mom and dad, but someone who's not their mom and dad that they can confide in, that they can go to, that has taken time in their life, that texts them, that calls them, that notices when they're missing. Number 2 that young people say is they experienced worship services that were not age segregated. So that's not every week, but there were times that they were involved with people who were not their age. Because lots of teenagers go off to college having never been in an adult worship service. And then they start looking for a church in college, and it's all deeply unfamiliar. They don't know the language, they don't know the grammar, they don't know the cadence. They aren't used to it, and so it feels foreign. They struggle to plug in, and they slowly drift away. And number 3 is that they have experienced a transcendent experience with God, which is why we invest in Vacation Bible School, camp, NYC, all of these sort of events, because we want our kids to experience God in a tangible way. And so those are the 3 things that young people say when they stay in the church. They can all eventually articulate those 3 things. They met God personally in a transcendent way. They had someone in their life who wasn't their own parents that invested them, and they went to worship services at least occasionally with people who weren't their own age. And so I share all this. It's kind of research-based. I hope it's not boring. I hope it's interesting. I hope it's compelling to get involved, because we matter in the story of our children. We may not have kids in our house anymore. We might still be actively in the thick of raising kids, but we can be a part of helping others get to know Jesus and stay connected to the faith their entire life. This is why we do what we do at Crossroads. And I'm reminded in closing of another story that Jesus tells. Jesus says in our text today, the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. Another time he talks about the kingdom of heaven, he talks about the kingdom of heaven as if it was a treasure in the field. And he says, a man finds this treasure in a field, and what would he do immediately? Well, you and I know economics well enough to know that if the treasure was worth more than the field and no one knew about it, we would sell everything. We would cash out our 401k. We would get a home equity loan. We would clear everything to buy that field, because we would have more than we have now, because we've discovered a secret in that field. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like the man who sells everything in order to buy the field that the treasure was on. He says, when you see the kingdom of heaven, it's worth giving up and selling everything. It's worth letting everything else go so that you can have this, because it's worth more than everything else. And if that's the case, it seems to me that it's worth taking the risk of time, money, effort to help others experience the kingdom of heaven as well. It costs us so little to show up, to be involved, to help finance, to help staff, to help serve our kids and our teens. And if the kingdom of heaven is worth selling everything, it is probably worth donating an hour every week. If the kingdom of heaven is worth selling everything, it's probably worth giving some money in an offering, or sending a kid to camp, or showing up at youth group, or taking a kid out to lunch. If the kingdom of heaven is worth selling everything for, it's probably worth us investing just a little bit, time and again, so the generation behind us gets to experience what Jesus told us matters, that we clear the way that kids can get to him. We're going to sing a final song today, and I'm going to invite you to stand and worship and contemplate and pray and ask God how he might show you might be involved in kids' lives, teens' lives, ministry for young, whatever it is. Let's stand and sing together.